Hello and welcome to part 1 of episode number 197. This is the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com and I am Cornelius Fichtner. Nice to have you with us. Many of you will remember Joel Fleiss from our past interviews with the PMI Los Angeles Book Club. We heard him review one of Patrick Lencioni's books. But Joel is more than just a book reviewer. He is a senior project manager and project management consultant in his own right. He has worked in our industry for several decades, both as a project manager and in development of project management software. And he has seen the good, the bad, and the ugly projects. And it's the ugly projects that fascinated him most, as he was wondering, why do we have such a bad track record in successful projects, and what can we do about it? The answer to this question can, and does, fill several books, so it's not surprising that we had to cut this interview and his answers up and deliver it to you as a 2-part series. This episode of the Project Management Podcast is sponsored by our free newsletter, the PDU Insider. The mission of the PDU Insider is to provide information and education about professional development units, those PDUs, to holders of PMI credentials. We want to help you understand the continuing certification requirements program, shed light on the various categories in which you can earn your PDUs, and help find high-quality PDU activities that not only allow you to earn PDUs, but most importantly, help you grow as a project manager. So stop by at pduinsider.com and sign up for the free newsletter. Earning PDUs was never simpler. In part 1 of our look at portfolio failure, Joel and I are going to look at a definition of project failure, project methodology evolution, goals and tactics, project selection, requirements management, schedules, and testing. Joel will explore what the problems are and what he recommends can be done about it. Joel Fleiss is the president of EPS, providing portfolio management software tools that simplify determining how to optimally select which projects should be funded from a portfolio of potential projects and optimally allocating labor resources across multiple projects to maximize an organization's return on investment. He is a member of the Project Management Institute and has his PMP certificate. He was responsible for product design in 3 companies that he worked for or owned, and has managed the successful implementation of numerous software products. He was the project manager or acted as the project office director for hundreds of successful projects, during which time he started putting together the foundation for what has become the ABCs of requirements-based project management. And now, get out your copy of the Chaos Report and enjoy the interview.
Project Management Podcasts Feature Interview.
Today with Joel Fleiss, President of Enterprise Portfolio Software Incorporated.
Hello, Joel. Welcome to the Project Management Podcast.
Hello, Cornelius. It's a real pleasure to be here again.
Well, and we're happy to have you. Most of our listeners, they know you from the PMI Los Angeles Book Club podcasts that we are doing, but today you are here in your own right discussing project portfolio failure. We're going to do 2 podcasts on this series discussing how we can help future projects to mitigate the really terrible track record that we have with so many unsuccessful projects. So to get us started here, tell us a little bit about what are the topics that we are going to discuss in our 2 podcasts.
Cornelius, in this podcast, I will cover the definition of project failure, project methodology evolution. We'll look at the goals and tactics to help mitigate this horrible problem. We'll talk about project selection and how organizations select their projects and how we can improve that. We'll then talk about 3 topics that are very relevant to project failure. That's requirements, schedules, and testing. Then in the second podcast, I'll cover cost estimations. I'll cover workflows and warnings, staff productivity, and then finally, labor resource allocation. Of course, during it and at the end of both sessions, I'll answer whatever questions you might have.
All right. Well, then, let me start out with my first question for you right away. You mentioned project failure. What is project failure? How do you define project failure?
Well, let me not give you my definition. Let me give you the industry definition. And they define it as not satisfying the triple constraint of cost, schedule, and scope, where scope is all the project's requirements. Many in the industry like to include satisfying the end user or the sponsor success criteria, being that you may produce the greatest product in a project, but if the end user doesn't like the product, well, the project really wasn't a success.
All right. Earlier on, I said that we have a really terrible track record, and you also mentioned, it wasn't a success. What are some of these failure statistics here that we have? What do we know about failing projects?
Well, probably the most recognized group that does surveys about project success and failure is the Standish Group. Mm-hmm. They've been doing it for significantly over a decade. And every 2 years, they come out with a new set of statistics for 3 project categories, which are successful, challenged, and failed. By successful, they mean a project that was delivered on time, within budget, fulfilling all the requirements. By challenged, they mean a project that was delivered over budget, late, or with less than the required features. And by failed, they mean a project that was canceled prior to its final delivery. Now, in 2008, we had 32% of the projects successful. In 2010, we had one of the first increases in a long time, and that 37% of the projects were successful, meaning slightly over 1/3. Challenged, meaning that the project was either late, over budget, or didn't satisfy all the requirements. In 2008, it was 44% challenged, and in 2010, it was 42%. And failed, 2008 was 24%, and in 2010 was 21%. So you can see that we're approximately 1 out of every 3 projects, slightly better than 1 out of every 3 projects are successful. And this survey that was conducted by the Standish Group was for worldwide projects. There were more than 10,000 projects that they looked at. Another fact that's even more disturbing is that large projects tend to fail more often than small projects.
Wow, those are absolutely amazing numbers. I mean, I heard that they were bad, and I've looked at older chaos reports, but I haven't seen the latest numbers there. And even in 2010, only 37% successful. That is just abysmal. What can we do about it?
A great question. The short answer is to just use better project management tools, combined with a better and improved project management methodology. As a software tool builder for over 4 decades, you can tell I'm old since I have over 4 decades worth of experience, along with my co-founders of my company, we had to believe that organizations with better tools could significantly improve on these horrendous statistics. So about 10 years ago, we started perusing the internet for what were the major reasons projects failed, and more importantly, why did large organizations conducting multiple projects have such a low success rate? We read everything we could get our hands on, mostly from the internet, and also discussed project failures with numerous project managers, business analysts, project office directors, and executives involved in multiple projects varying in size from $25,000 to multiple billions of dollars. We also tapped into our own experience, and for a couple years, 2002 and 2003, we merely tried to understand all the problems.
what I notice and what everybody in the industry sees is that the methodologies that we're using, and you mentioned methodologies earlier on, they're changing constantly. New methodologies are coming up. New methodologies are being employed. How do you see this trend here? How can it help?
Well, we really look at it as it's gone through three methodologies, which are what we call the get-it-done methodology, the waterfall methodology, and the agile methodology. In the get-it-done methodology, projects were conducted without any significant planning and often without a forecast as to schedule, cost, or detailed scope. If there were estimates, it was just almost always seat of the pants. You might think of examples of these projects as maybe being the pyramids back a few years in 2630 to about 2611 BC. The Brooklyn Bridge which was built from 1870 to 1883. The Hoover Dam, which was built from 1931 to 1936. And the Manhattan Project, which was 1939 to 1945. The waterfall methodology is a sequential process that was developed in 1956. There are many derivations of it, and its original birth was for software projects. And what it did really was it divided the project into a sequential set of phases. Different organizations gave slightly different names to each of these phases, but they were all pretty much the same. And the number of phases usually varied from one organization to another from about 4 to 8. Some organizations called the phases stages, but they were synonymous. In the past, for most of our projects, prior to just recently, by just recently I mean the last 5 or 6 years, we followed a 6-phase waterfall method where we called the 6 phases initiation, analysis, design, development, verification, and deployment. The Agile methodology tries to break a project into small functional components and then prioritize the components with the customer's input and deliver operational components in short periods that they call sprints. And they keep on repeating the process until the project is completed. At the end of each sprint, they communicate with the customer and talk about it. A major part of this podcast is to describe what we think is the next logical step in dramatically increasing the project success rate. We're calling the next methodology synergistic.
In the past few months here on the podcast, we have done a few Agile discussions. We looked at the Agile Manifesto and how it relates to us project managers. And also we looked at various criteria people can use in regards to selecting either Agile or Waterfall. So let me ask you this here. What are some of the positive aspects that you see in the Agile methodology?
Great question, Cornelius. What we see as the major positives of the Agile methodology are, one, small teams seem to build a lot of synergy amongst their members, and they become more productive. Implementing small project components provides concrete, achievable goals, so the customer gets to see results rather than waiting for the end. Building viable components helps the end user better understand what it is he really needed. Successful deliveries invigorate the team, management, and end users, so you're not waiting for the end to finally see results. The small team with a staff wearing multiple hats helps eliminate team members waiting on dependent tasks to complete, thus eliminating wasted staff time. Lots of times in the waterfall, one person says, I can't do my job until somebody else finishes their job because my task is dependent on their task. And multiple viable components obtain early end user and management buy-in, which is also very critical.
And what about the negatives?
Negatives. I'm glad you asked that question too, because there are a few. Many of us old-timers feel the following. There's an old pundit that's called failing to plan is planning for failure. And a lot of us say, hey, that fits Agile perfectly. If there's insufficient time spent defining the requirements and creating a detailed design, oftentimes the key component interfaces downstream will have a higher probability of causing major issues. Having everybody on the Agile team or the Scrum team do a little of everything doesn't optimize the use of individual team members' unique talents. I mean, if A few years back, we started a whole industry in the United States called the automobile industry with Henry Ford and his production lines of everybody doing special little things and becoming quite talented at the things that they did. Major projects with multiple implementation teams cause serious interface problems. You could think of building a large house. Instead of creating a detailed plan with architectural drawings, if the family just states that they want an approximate 4,500-foot house with 12 rooms, and they decide that the kitchen is the most important room, so let's build the kitchen first. And after the kitchen's built, the family approves or disapproves the kitchen, and finally it gets approved. Then the family decides the next most important room is the living room, and they build a living room, but they say, hey, I don't want the living room adjacent to the kitchen. And the family eventually approves the living room. And when the house is finally done, they'd say, wow, the house doesn't flow exactly like we planned it. Well, it would be like heck to move those rooms around after you've built it. Same thing goes with software. So when you build components separately and don't think about the future, you often end up with an effort that isn't exactly what you wanted.
We started out in your original discussion here with the get it done, then we moved over to the waterfall, then we looked at agile, and you also mentioned synergistic as the next thing to do, and I think that's the one you are advocating, right?
Obviously. We're calling the new methodology synergistic, which for this, it's actually part of something that we're building. After you hear the podcast, you'll understand what differentiates it from waterfall and agile and allow organizations to make a quantum leap in the percentage of successfully completed projects. We think this is a giant step, not exactly for mankind conquering the moon, but in space, but for mankind making projects more successful.
So what's your basic goal here? What are the tactics used to improve the way organizations conduct projects in this synergistic style?
You know, our basic goal is to improve an organization's project portfolio success rate. The tactics we plan to use to accomplish this is that for organizations conducting multiple projects concurrently, to use vastly improved software tools and an improved methodology. The strategy is that we need our project management tools to perform tasks on a daily basis that are impossible for a project manager, a business analyst, and project team members to do on a timely basis. That helps organizations be more successful with conducting projects that finish on time, within budget, and fully satisfy all the project's requirements.
Okay, let's begin at the beginning here, because you mentioned project selection. Can you describe to us how most large organizations go about selecting the projects that they are ready to fund for implementation?
Our senior staff members, unfortunately I'm the most senior, as consultants have participated in 4 major organizations' project selection process. So this isn't just hearsay, it's actual practical experience. In general, they all seem to perform the following common functions. 1, they encouraged all their staff members during the year to suggest new ideas to improve their existing products or create new products. Then executives would appoint a sponsor for each one. Then the sponsor, with the help of his or her staff, created a business case describing the project's costs for the projected costs, for the project and its anticipated return on investment, or ROI. The organization then usually created an executive committee of senior C-level executives to determine which projects shall be selected. The committee members were given a few days to review the business cases created by the sponsors for each potential project. The committee would then establish the rules for project selection. Usually the committee would work anywhere from about 10 to 20 working days to determine which project should be implemented. The sponsor of the project would usually make a presentation after he created a business case in front of the executive committee describing why his or her project should be implemented. The committee would then deliberate and choose which projects to fund. This would occur usually once a year in the companies that we dealt with. We had heard some companies do it twice a year, and we even now know of one company that does it every quarter.
All right, that sounds like a pretty straightforward process, the one that I am also used to from my background working in a large financial institution. That's pretty much how it was done. What's bad about
it? It does sound very reasonable because this is exactly what most companies do with a few minor caveats.
Mm-hmm.
Where the executive committees that we saw consisted of about a dozen to maybe 20 people, and they were the highest paid staff members. So the problems we saw were the following four items. They were the number of criteria. The criteria that they used to select projects basically were the cost and return on investment. And those are two very important criteria. But there are a lot of other criteria that should be used. For example, technical risk, financial risk, cash flow, compliance with government regulation, synergy with existing products, just to mention a few. We'll talk about more later when we get into selecting projects in more detail. Another area is politics. Too often we saw sponsors that were friends of key executive project selection committee members have their project selected as opposed to a more worthy project from another sponsor that wasn't a friend of the executive committee. Once, in my own personal experience, I was questioning a CEO as why they were selecting a project instead of another one, which offered a far better return for the organization. And basically I was told he was a golf buddy. So it was hard to argue with that. Another thing that you find is these executives aren't always the experts in all the criteria that should be used for determining which projects are selected. So they're not necessarily the foremost experts in the areas. It would be much nicer to evaluate each project for each criteria using your experts in your organization. And the fourth thing, and probably the most important, is what I call timeliness. The world's always changing. What is a good selection today may be a terrible selection tomorrow or next week. The reason the organizations do it so infrequently is it's a really expensive ordeal. They're using their key people, spending 2 to 4 weeks of time to make this decision, and all these people are making, somewhere above $250,000 to maybe even $1 million a year. So it's not an inexpensive event taking these people away from what they're supposed to be doing for the company's well-being to selecting the projects.
Okay, so it's getting more and more complicated here as we're moving along through this process. What are you proposing to, lessen the problem and to improve the way organizations select their project portfolio?
Well, first thing I would do, first thing our methodology that we propose is that you form an executive committee to decide what criteria you will use and how important that criteria is. So the tool should support a number of built-in criteria and be flexible enough to add whatever each organization wants for their additional criteria and allow them to say how important one criteria is relative to another. To give you an example of some other criteria, it's alignment with organizational goals, competitive advantage, cost, financial risk, technical risk, management risk, synergy with other projects, success factor, security, synergism with projects, etc. So we have in our proposed system 23 built-in criteria. Now each criteria has what we call an importance factor, or we call it a weight. Some of the weights are positive, some of the weights are negative. Why would you have a negative weight? Sometimes the more you have of something, the less likely you are you want to do the project. For example, cost is a good example of a negative weight. The more cost you have for a potential project, the less likely you want to do that. Same thing with technical risk. The more technical risk you have, the less likely you want to do the project. Whereas ROI, for example, the more ROI you have, the more likely you are you want to do the project. So another thing is experts. You want to be able to make sure that your experts can evaluate each thing. So one criteria might be compliance with government regulations. Your company may want to be compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley. And, you wouldn't just want your normal 12 to 15 executives making that decision. You'd probably want your legal staff to evaluate whether each project has Sarbanes-Oxley implications and how you'd evaluate. You would instruct your evaluators to give a score for each potential project as soon as possible and whenever a change occurs. So if something in the world changes, that affects that criteria, you certainly want to look at each project and alter the score. And what this does is it gives you a continuous ranking of your projects every day, and you understand which projects are more important than other projects, which is very important to our tool for some of the other features that it should provide.
Talking about your tool right now, let's jump into your tool for a second, because what I've heard so far is you haven't made the process easier for me. Right? All that you have done is you have taken the human factor out of it, and you said, okay, instead of having 5 criteria, we now have 23, and we're moving them into a tool, right? We know from your biography that you founded your company in 2004, and since then you developed a enterprise portfolio software called Epora. Give me a high-level understanding of how Epora is different from other portfolio solutions and how it helps me in this project selection phase.
That's a tough assignment. Okay.
Yeah, you have 120 seconds.
Well, I'm going to discuss that in some of the following questions. I hope that you're going to ask me. But one of the ways that Epora does things that it needs for all its other features is to understand the project ranking. So we've discussed that in a little bit of detail, and then it adds some criteria. And the difference is that instead of the main difference being that we use your experts to do the evaluation, and we have more criteria. So we get a much better ranking. We also get an audit trail of the ranking, and we continuously know which are your most important projects. I'm going to talk about such features that knowing that what are your projects ranking is that we can now allocate your labor resources across all your projects much more efficiently. One of the main features of the tool that we see in this improved methodology that dramatically improves your success rate is the ability to make much better use of your resources and improve their productivity by a significant percentage, which we're going to talk about later. So we're going to talk about those sort of features in our tool.
Okay, it looks like you took less than 120 seconds to answer that question. So earlier you also mentioned that requirements are a culprit that leads to project failure. So what's the main problem with requirements that will lead to a project failure?
When we looked at requirements, we saw 5 areas of problems. We saw gathering of requirements, we saw ambiguities, we saw continuous changes, we saw cost, and we saw verification. So let me explain. Do you want me to elaborate on that?
Go ahead.
So let's talk gathering requirements. The main problem in gathering requirements is collaboration. You want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So we looked at the market, and there were numerous fantastic collaboration tools available. We didn't see anything that we could do significantly and better than any of the existing collaboration tools. There are plenty out there, and we didn't see how that helped any of the other parts of our tool or what a tool should do. So we felt that gathering requirements exist out there, and companies are doing a reasonable job. All you have to do is read some literature, make a nice selection, and there are more than one nice products out there, and you can do it. By ambiguities, we mean the fact that a requirement has multiple interpretations of the same requirement, something you don't want. You don't want Cornelius looking at a requirement and says, I understand what that's supposed to be. And Joel looks at it and he has a different interpretation. And our testing group looks at it and has a third interpretation. And our developers look at it and they have a fourth interpretation. So the developers develop it and they say, wow, I did a great job. The testers test it and say, no, you didn't, because they have different interpretation of what it should do. And we as end users, even when those two agree, we have different interpretations. So you want to get out any ambiguities. So the question becomes, what makes ambiguities? Well, one thing that makes ambiguities is adjectives. You don't want to see a requirement that has an adjective in it. An example might be that this will be pretty. So if you were building a house and you said, hey, this room will be pretty, well, it's pretty to Cornelius, may not be pretty to Joel or Betty. So you want to make sure there's no adjectives in your requirements. Same thing goes with adverbs. You don't want to see something that says this will be fast. You want every requirement to be measurable or to not have multiple interpretation. Likewise, you don't want requirements to have too many words. And the reason for that is the more words you have in a requirement describing something, the more apt it is to have multiple interpretations and ambiguities. And the fourth reason is that you don't want to have difficult words in it. You don't want to show how smart you are and use very esoteric type words that a very small population knows, and everybody has to use a dictionary to figure out what you're saying. You want it to be fairly simple. So what you want is you want a software tool that will inform you whenever you have a requirement that has ambiguities in it. So that's one of the things that we look at. The next thing is continuous change. Lots of times the people that control the requirements and make the changes aren't necessarily the people that are most concerned, the executives. So you want to realize every time a change is made so you can understand the impact of that change. Another important thing is cost. Lots of times people make a change in a project's requirements and do not understand what the cost impact is. They can usually understand what the schedule impact is, because usually what people will do when they change a requirement is they'll adjust their Microsoft project schedule or Primavera or whatever scheduling tool they use, and they'll look at it and they can say, wow, I can see what the dates are, but it's hard for them to understand how this requirement affects the cost. So they can't look at a requirement and say, this requirement is really costing us another $38,000. Is it really worth it for that $38,000? And the last one that we wanted to talk about was verification. A big mistake people make is that if you look at a lot of documents, you'll see that they'll have paragraph numbers. They'll say something like 8.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.11, and they'll have multiple paragraphs or pages that describe that requirement. What you really want is you want each requirement to be a separate statement. And the reason for that is you want to be able to look at each requirement and see that what are the test cases that are needed to verify that this requirement is viable. So what you want to avoid is multiple sentences, conjunctions, and too many words. Thus, we need a tool that makes it easier to specify each requirement separately and avoid these three problems. So that's what we're suggesting in a tool.
All right, that's it for the requirements, I take it, and what the problem is and how to address it. But I know that you mentioned it in the beginning that we also want to talk about schedule and testing. So let's take a look at those two. So what's the problem with schedules other than we're absolutely unable to meet our schedules usually? Well, according to the Standish Group at least.
There's a lot of excellent scheduling tools. I mean, most people are familiar with Microsoft Project or Primavera or Cytor or Niku Workbench, and I could name on another 50, but I think though if you took those 5 there, you'd probably have 80 to maybe 98% of the market. And, unfortunately, a lot of project managers know a lot of the nuances of schedules. That, but knowing all the nuances doesn't make you a great or even a good scheduler. I kind of like to relate it to an individual who knows everything about Microsoft Word, but that doesn't make him a good author. They're two different arts. So writing schedules is a little bit different than knowing how every feature works in the scheduling tool. And the mistakes that I've seen as a consultant is that there's too many fixed dates in schedules. There's lots of times missing resources on what we call low-level tasks, a low-level task being a task that doesn't have any subtasks. The task durations are too long. The clarity of the task is not there. And a lot of times the tasks are missing an action. That every task should have an action item so you know what to do.
And last but not least, once the tasks have been implemented, they also have to be tested. So what's the problem with the testing? How does that lead to failures, and how do we avoid them?
Good question again. Okay, so we do projects for a very simple reason, and that's to either improve a product or service or to create a new product or service. And far too often, testing is just like neglected until the very end of the project. And what needs to be done is that testing should occur in the project from almost its inception. And it should be done in parallel to the development and the specification. So if you follow what we're recommending to make the requirements unambiguous and testable, Then as you specify the requirements, an organization can in parallel create a test plan that contains the test cases that you're going to comprehensively test each low-level requirement. These tests might include functional tests, performance tests, diagnostic tests, stress tests, and limitation tests. Not every requirement requires all 5 different test types, but they almost all need a functional test. Unfortunately, most organizations look at testing as an afterthought and start developing the test cases near the end of the project, and are almost always pushed for time to get the results of the project, a product, or a service to market, and thus do not come close to fully testing the project's end results. The testing of requirements is probably the most important set of tests that any project should have. Of course, you want to use use cases and other types of tests too, not to be neglected, but the requirement testing is by far the most important.
Okay, I believe this is about it for the first part of our interview here. But before we close this out, let's leave our listeners with some recommendation that they can work on between now and the next time that they hear us. Some advice here. What are your 2, maybe 3 recommendations that you have for our listeners in regards to what they can do today on their ongoing projects in order to avoid failure in the areas that we have discussed?
Great. Let me give you 4, if that's okay, Corey.
Okay, well, take 4.
You always take 4. First, I think you can improve the way you select projects. 2, when you create and maintain requirements, if you think about those items that I talked about, adjectives and adverbs and too many words and complex words, you want to try to avoid those in the requirements, and you want to make each requirement as simple as possible. 3, when you create and maintain schedules, you would likewise want to make sure that you don't have low-level tasks that exceed 40 hours. You want to make sure that you have proper use of dependencies, etc. And 4th, you want a better way of estimating project cost, which I didn't slightly talk about, but I meant to, in that you want to be able to link every requirement to what the tasks are that are needed for its implementation. When you look at it, what a project should cost, well, what a project should cost is its requirements. I mean, that's what you're really saying. So you should have everything in the requirements that accomplishes the project. Well, what should the requirements cost? Well, that should really be what your tasks are. So everything in your schedule should be what implements the requirements. So then what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to take each low-level requirement and link it to one or more tasks for its accomplishment. Now, each requirement won't use entirely use every task, and then some tasks will be shared across multiple requirements. So you want to be able to do that on a percentage basis. And that way, you're going to have if the requirements are proper and the tasks are proper, you're going to have a very true reflection of the cost. You can instantaneously get the cost at any time of your project, or you can get the cost of any requirement in milliseconds instead of waiting days or weeks for somebody to figure out what the cost is.
Wonderful. Well, Joel, thank you very much for part 1 of the interview here, and thank you very much also for giving us 4 recommendations when we only asked for 2.
Thank you, Cornelius. We really appreciate this opportunity of discussing how we can improve organizations' project success rates.
And that was Joel Fleiss and part 1 of our interview on project portfolio failure. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. If you are a PMP or PGMP and you're looking for a simple and effective way to earn your PDUs, then try our sister podcast, the PDU Podcast. Get a new webinar and at least 1 new PDU every month on autopilot. Stop by at pducast.com. That's pducast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com, and when you write, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. Even a failing project has benefits, but we speak of those in the future tense. Until next time.